and Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua, one in the olive tree. Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua's love.
Hello again, my friends. All prophecy fulfilled. We are in our series, lesson number 6, in fact, of Gentiles, Christianity's best kept secret. And last lesson, we were in Hosea chapter 1 and 2. In fact, we planted there for a couple lessons. And I think I promised you that I was going to get into Romans chapter 1, and we'll see if I can make that happen today. I don't know. We'll see. And I don't know if you realize this, but Hosea chapter 1 and 2 is really, really close contextually to Hosea chapter 3 and 4. Imagine that, right? So here's what I want to do. I actually want to just cover some of that right now real quick, as quickly as I can. Let me give you about a 60-second summary of Hosea chapter 3, since we are familiar with Hosea chapter 2 at this point. Hosea chapter 3 is like a paragraph long. It's really kind of unique. It's only like 5 verses. And basically, Hosea 3 is like a snapshot of like the next, 700 years or so for Ephraim or for Israel. It's an interesting little chapter. It's like a summary of Israel's trajectory under the curse of the law and what happens to them. So basically, you know the drill. They're forsaking Yahweh, and here's what Hosea has to say to them in verse 4. He says, "For the children of Israel shall abide many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, without ephod or teraphim." Well, what does that mean? Well, all those things, those were part and parcel. Those were attached to their sacrificial system, of law. That was their world right there. And that's pretty much, think about it, that's like the exact same thing, really, that Hosea said in chapter 2. He said their feast days, their Sabbaths, those things would cease. They're gone. Bye-bye, right? And then, if you go one more verse, verse 5, we see, which is basically a reiteration of what I've read about 800 times already in Deuteronomy 4. He says this, afterward, well, after what? Well, after what he just said in verse 4. After many days, they're going to go without sacrifice, sacred pillar, ephod. So afterwards, after all these, these feast days of cease and all that, afterward, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They shall fear the Lord and his goodness, when? In the latter days. Now, doesn't that sound exactly like Deuteronomy 4? It does to me. That was the good news in the last days, when some of them would seek him, they would turn from their idols, and they would serve the living God. Okay, pushing in to Hosea chapter 4. This is really what I want to get to today. Basically, to be honest with you, it's the same old thing. The entire chapter, everything, Hosea 4, the entire thing, well, the entire book really, but the entire chapter is basically one big indictment upon Israel. For what? Well, for her idolatry. It's the same old tune, and you're probably tired of hearing it. Well, I kind of am too, right? It's Israel, 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 idolatry, idolatry. You've forsaken me. I'm going to cast you out. I'm going to do this. Blah, blah, blah. Over and over again, right? Okay, I get it. So here's our assignment today. I want you to notice here in Hosea 4 what this Israel's sad story under law. I want you to notice what this really looks like. I want you to really focus in on the picture that Hosea is painting. And I want you to notice how Hosea describes Israel in this condition and what the consequences are of this condition and their actions. Now, pay attention. Listen to the language. Listen to the words. Words are important. Language is important. So here's what I'm going to do for you. Here's what I'll do for you. Instead of just actually reading through the entire chapter, that would take forever, I went through Hosea 4, and I made a list of two things. List number one is, how is Israel described? How are they portrayed? And number two, what are the consequences? What are the ramifications of that? Okay, so here's the list, and you can go through and fact check this. Open up your Bible, read through Hosea 4, and this is what you're going to find. Here's a condensed list. Israel is described, they are portrayed as a people without truth or mercy. They are described as people who are unrestrained in their sinning. They're out of control. They're swearing, lying, killing, stealing, and partaking in adultery. They have their hearts set on their iniquity, naturally, because they're unrestrained. They have a lack of knowledge of God, that is. They have rejected knowledge. They have forgotten the law. They have no understanding. We've seen that before. That's like an unwise people, right? They have played the harlot. They are joined to idols. Not only that, they ask counsel from their wooden idols. What else we got here? They sacrifice on mountains. That's a no-no. They burn incense on hills, under trees, oaks, poplars. Why? Because they love the shade. And I think that's a people who are grateful to, and it seems to be painting a picture, they even worship the creation itself. Giving you a clue there. They are described as being enslaved in their heart, and they are stubborn. Whew! That is a bad, nasty, ugly picture, isn't it? Well, that's how they describe. Okay, so what are the consequences of that? How is God going to react to that? Well, again, no surprises here, right? We've been through this, but pay attention to the language. The language, we need to store this in your head because we're going to come around to it. Well, the land would mourn and its inhabitants would waste away. Well, what inhabitants? Well, part of the inhabitants that would waste away would be the beast of the field, the birds of the air, and even the fish of the sea. Well, that's interesting. They would be rewarded for their deeds. In fact, I think in chapter 5, he says, yours, Ephraim, yours, Israel, is the judgment. You know, the judgment, it always pertains, it always is around, it always is connected to law. Did you know that? Judgment in the Bible? It's not just random judgment. Anyway, they would be trampled. They would be ashamed. They would be destroyed for their lack of knowledge. They would be left alone. In fact, later on in chapter 5, it says that God would actually withdraw from them. I will withdraw from you. Yahweh said, I will forget your children. And finally, he says, I will change their glory into shame. Now, I know, right there, you recognize that. You're like, hey, beep, 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 alert. I know that. I've heard that somewhere. Yeah, it probably reminds you of Romans chapter 1. So I think you know where I'm going with this, because I think I gave you a clue last lesson, and I said, hey, we're going to get into Romans chapter 1. But I guess the question is, do you know why I was going to jump into Romans 1 from Hosea chapter 4? And that's because it's really not a jump whatsoever. What most people don't seem to realize is that Romans chapter 1 and 2 is actually pulling from Hosea chapter 4. Right here. What I just went through that list, Romans chapter 1, Paul is pulling from that. That is, he is using Hosea as proof. He's using that as his teaching text to explain how the Gentiles, there you go, in his day, and the ones that he's referencing in Romans chapter 1 are in fact the very same Gentiles Hosea is referencing here. Israel. Israelite-gentiles. And that's why I said pay attention to the language. That's why I made the list here, because we're going to do that, and we're going to see the exact same thing in Romans chapter 1. We're going to see the striking similarities. We're going to see the obvious parallels. And it ain't no coincidence. So let me just say this one more time, because I keep pounding this home. The distinction or the dichotomy between Jew and Gentile within the Bible, it is not a generic, broad brush distinction within all humanity. That's not it. No, according to the prophets, the distinction is within all Israel. That's the distinction, and it originates and that concept develops in the prophets. Does that make sense? Not all humanity within all Israel. There's your distinction right there. And by the way, so many people so far really have kicked against what I think is a very clear picture of Israel actually becoming Gentile. And they say all the time, you know what, Ryan? No. It never says that Israel would become Gentile or Goyim. It says that they would be among the Gentiles or Goyim, right? And I'm like, well, actually, no. If you go back to Genesis chapter 48, that's exactly what it says. That they, Ephraim, they would actually become a multitude of Goyim, a multitude of nations. Or, if you're going to translate it, if you're going to be consistent with Gentile, they would become a multitude of Gentiles. And I know that doesn't sound right. And this is what I'm trying to show you. How Abraham's seed, Abraham's descendants, to them were the promises. To Israel were the promises. To Israel were given the covenants. To Israel was given and placed under the curse of the law. Israel was cut off. Israel was cast off. Israel was scattered into the Goyim, becoming the very Gentiles that we see in the New Testament, who were receiving the very promises that were given at the beginning of the story, which pertain to Israel. It all comes full circle. That's what I'm explaining to you. And I guess the reason I'm kind of covering this again here, I'm like, why are you going back to this again? You said this a million times. Because I know it seems redundant, but I keep running across verse after verse after verse that verifies what I'm saying all the time. It just keeps coming out of the woodwork. For example, we were in Hosea chapter 4, right? And I mentioned in verse 6 on my list, I said one of the consequences on that side of the list, it says, I will forget your children. This is Yahweh saying, I'm going to forget your children. Well, what does that look like? Well, if we just keep reading a little bit more, Hosea chapter 5 through 7, listen to this. Listen. Israel and Ephraim stumble in their iniquity. Judah also stumbles with them. With their flocks and herds they shall go seek the Lord. But they will not find him. He, Yahweh, has withdrawn himself from them. Listen to this. They have dealt treacherously with the Lord, for they, Ephraim, Israel, they have begotten pagan children. What? Pagan children? Now, we can question the translation here. That particular word, the Hebrew word, is zur, and it means stranger. It means to be estranged from. It's very close to like being a foreigner. Stranger. Your children are going to be stranger. It's interesting that they translate it pagan. Maybe that's the brunt of it. Now, think with me here for a second. Think. He just said in chapter 4, I'm going to forget your children, right? They're out of here. And he's saying, your children will be pagans. They will be strangers. They're cast out. They're made zurs, strangers. They were Gentile. Folks, these are Israelites. Israelites were made strangers to the covenant community. And I know so many of you want me to hurry up, Ryan, get into the New Testament, deal with Cornelius, deal with the Samaritan woman, deal with, the Canaanite woman who had great faith, or this person, or that person, and that person, right? Because I know you're hoping we can get there, and we can just find this one verse or this one example that opens up the new covenant to you and me. And, I know that's what you're hoping for. And I'm just saying, you know what? We'll get there, but chill out a little bit. I'm just trying to drive this story home. I really want to build a solid foundation, because I'm trying to reiterate time and time again what the prophets keep saying time and time again. And that must be important if they keep saying it time and time again. If we've got a book here that is this thick and over 3/4 of it are Old Testament and this little portion is the New Testament, I think we ought to focus on that foundation part. Don't you? Doesn't that make sense? So anyway, it's, for me, I think, I don't know why, but we have such a hard time, and it's like we have a resistance to slowing down a little bit, especially when we do get to the New Testament. Here's what drives me bonkers. When we get to the New Testament, it's almost like we just kind of have a shut-off mode where our memory has been wiped clean, and we don't remember the cumulative case that the prophets have made all throughout the story, right? All along the way, verse upon verse upon verse, describing Israelites in the nation portrayed as animals, unclean, pagan practices, made strangers to God, right? And we forget that it's Israel's story under law. It's Israel's redemption from the curse of the law, right? That is the story. That is the contextual setting in the New Testament when we get to that little section that's only this thick. Why? Because that's the end. The New Testament is really just the ending of the Old Testament. That's really all it is. It's the end of the story. It's the last couple chapters. It's the ending of what's come before it. And that's the lens, that's the filter that we have to look through when we get there. And I'm afraid that we just have such a hard time doing that. So, you know what? Here's what I'm going to do. Let me demonstrate what I'm talking about, because I feel like I'm just not connecting with some of you here. You're just, I think when we do that, what I just said, when we read everything in the New Testament in light of its Old Testament background, through that lens, everything becomes, I think, so much more clearer. And I think it becomes more consistent with the rest of the story. Let me give you an example, okay? Here we go. I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. Listen to this. I just read Hosea chapter 5, verse 7. Yahweh said, your children, Israel, they're going to be strangers, right, into the nations. They're going to be scattered into the nations. They're going to be Zurs. They're going to be made strangers. They're going to be strangers to me, right? You will be as distant to me as your pagan practices carry you. And that's exactly what happened. For they have begotten pagan children, strange children. So in light of that, in light of the entire, Old Testament story of Israel under law and covenant, here's an example. Here we have Paul addressing who? Who's in Ephesians? I'm going to use Ephesians as an example. Who is Paul addressing in Ephesians? Well, the Ephesians. Which Ephesians? Well, they're Gentiles, says everybody, right? Ephesians is addressed to Gentiles. Well, okay, so we all know that. That's fine. Here's the question, though. Which Gentiles? That is the responsible, contextual, accurate, correct question. And look, I think if you just have a modicum, an ounce, just a little bit of reasonableness in you, I think you're going to say, wait a minute, let's remember the story that came before this. What came before Paul's letter? And you're going to remember what Yahweh said through the prophets like Hosea. That's why Paul used Hosea. And when you come to passages like this in Ephesians chapter 2, I think there needs to be a major alert going off in your head, right? Beep, beep, I've heard this before. I've heard this before. I've seen this before. Hello, McFly, right? Listen, Ephesians chapter 2. Listen to the language. Just like you listen to the language in Hosea, listen to the language here in Ephesians. Ephesians 2. You, he made alive. who were dead. Wait a minute, these guys were dead? What killed according to the story? The law. The law killed. The law brought death. It killed me, said Paul. Dead in trespasses and sins. Now wait a minute. What trespasses and what sins are in view in the Bible all along the way according to the prophets? Well, the sins and trespasses of Israel under law, their sins. 70 weeks were determined to put away their sins. That's the story. So right there, we're into one sentence into chapter 2 of Ephesians, and right away, we ought to be honing in on Israel because of these particular terms, these phrases, are only phrases and terms that would be applicable to the story of Israel. You, he made alive, who were dead in trespasses and sins. Remember that you, once Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision. Wait a minute. You were once Gentiles in the flesh. Well, wouldn't that be applicable to Israel scattered into the nations who would become Gentiles in the flesh? They weren't practicing law. They weren't circumcised. Well, yeah, it sure would. According to the story, that's what happened. So shouldn't we be maybe honing in on that particular aspect of it? I think we should. At that time, you were without Christ, listen to this, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel. Was not Israel cut off? Made alien, if you will, to the commonwealth, to the covenant community of Israel? Yeah, they were. And strangers from the covenants of promise. Well, holy cow! They were made strangers from the covenant. What did I just read in Hosea 5:7? They would begot children who were pagan children who were strangers. It's the same thing. Why don't we draw from that to interpret this? I think we should. Strangers from the covenants of promise have no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off, wait a minute, time out again, hold your horses, who in the story was going to be made far off. How many verses have I read from Isaiah in all sorts of, well, all the prophets who said basically, Israel, you're going to be cast out and made far off. Daniel was praying about Israel who'd been scattered into all the countries, both far off and those near. In fact, in Ephesians chapter 2 here, Paul actually quotes from Isaiah, who's saying, hey, look, all you sons rejoice because you're going to come from afar. You're going to come from the nations from which you had been scattered. I mean, this isn't that difficult to connect. For he himself is our peace, who has made both one and has broken down the middle wall of separation, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, that is the law of the commandments. Now hold on a second. Why would pagans who had never anything to do with the law, why would they give a rip, much less understand anything to do about the abolition of the law, a law that pertained to only Israel? It doesn't make any sense. It makes a heck of a lot more sense if these are Jews and Gentiles, if these Gentiles were once Israel cast out because the law had pertained to them. Now that makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? Yeah, it does. Where was I? Contained in the ordinances, so as to create in himself one new man from the two, thus making peace, that he might reconcile them both to God in one body through the cross. You know, the only promise of reconciliation of two bodies coming together that I can see in the Old Testament by the prophets are the two houses coming back together to God through a new covenant. And he came and preached peace. peace. I think this is where Paul's quoting from Isaiah 59, I believe. And he came and preached peace to you who were afar off. That's Israel made afar, folks. And to those who were near. That sounds like Daniel 9 to me, both Israel far and near. You know, a covenant of peace. I believe a covenant of peace was offered to the house of Israel and the house of Judah throughout the Old Testament. For through him we both have access by one Spirit. Now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. Those who had been made zur, strangers, Israel's children, were no longer strangers. Folks, can you see it? These Gentiles that Paul is addressing, you know what? They're the very same. Paul is addressing the very same audience that James wrote to, the dispersion, that Peter wrote to, the pilgrims of the dispersion. It's the same audience. It's the same target audience. It's the same group of people. The only difference is in every single one of Paul's letter, he is narrowing in on a particular community, a particular city, particular people within a very particular area. It's not spread out. He's addressing very specific areas, people. And that's really the only difference. I'm wondering if you can see this. I mean, you can see the entire trajectory of Deuteronomy, from Deuteronomy 32 all the way here into Ephesians chapter 2. Both houses back together, gathered back together. This was their redemption. Okay, kind of went off on a tangent there. I promised that I would get into Romans 1, didn't I? Yeah. Well, you know what? Next lesson, I promise you, I will get into Romans chapter 1 and how in Romans 1, Paul is basically addressing these two groups within Israel, Jew and Gentile. And we're going to look at Gentiles through the lens of the prophets, and we're going to draw upon the prophets like Hosea. So go read Hosea chapter 4. That's important because that is going to line up, that's going to parallel, and we're going to use that to interpret Romans chapter 1 because that's what that's what Paul did. Anyway, okay, I think I'm done. Next time, Romans 1, how Israel exchanged their glory. Okay, we'll see you next round. Take care. Bye-bye.
Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua, one in the olive tree. Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah.